to Minden.
And Jim started off in the U.S. Air Force. He was a test pilot and then an instructor at test pilot school. And he had his first wave flight in 1971. And I think you've been fascinated with soaring in waves since then.
Absolutely. You know, in the rotor zone, the turbulence is so tremendous, and in the lifting zone, it is just so laminar. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a bit about the Soar Eagle project, because I think that's when you've been flying F-16s and you've been doing test flying for F-16s.
Exactly, the F-16XL, the one that had the delta wing on it, and I ended up becoming an instructor at the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, and they had this project called Soar Eagle. They had installed systems in a Grove 103. So we had systems that brought from all around the base. We had an F-16 liquid oxygen system. We had an X-15 bailout bottle. We had an F-4 turn needle and things like that. And with the pressure suit, I flew that to 42,200, which was a tropopause at that day. And what happens at the latitudes of Minden is at the tropopause, as you get in the stratosphere, the winds die off. And the wave tends not to propagate, so it just kind of goes up to 42. 40,000 feet, I had about 500 feet a minute lift. Get to 42, there's a little bit of turbulence. I mean, I went upwind, I went downwind, I went sideways, and I was unable to get higher.
Uh-huh. And so after that, you finished your career in the Air Force?
Yes, I did 22 years in the Air Force, and after I retired, that's about the time that GPS became available for documenting records. From my first time at Edwards back in 1981, I dreamed of doing speed records in the wave. But the trouble was, at that time, you're using cameras, and you had to start 1,000 meters from the ground. Well, that makes it really difficult to go fast in the wave because you spend so much time down in the rotor zone. But what happened was, in 96 or so, the GPS became available for records. Now, the first rules said you still had to start within 1,000 meters of the ground. But in the Sierra, in particular up by Inyukarn, there was a peak that was about 10,000 feet high in a range that's normally about 8,500, right next to where the wave sets up along the southern Sierra. So I put my finish point exactly over the top of that mountain, and I did a 100-kilometer triangle in the Discus A that I had at the time, and it was on a 217 kph or so. And it was actually disallowed because at that time the rules allowed the start and finish point to be 10 kilometers apart. So if you take a 100-kilometer triangle and the start and finish are 10 kilometers apart, you make it really flat. So I had to do it again on a triangle that was without the 10-kilometer tolerance.
Right, well, very well thought out. and then you became involved in the Perlan project.
Yes, Arnevoldsen, who started the Perlan project, he was a test pilot at then NASA Dryden, and I had a 126 when I first got to Edwards back in 1981. And so I met him at Rosamond, and so we knew each other, so we were familiar through the soaring connection. And when he was in Germany in the 90s, early 90s, testing Grove airplanes, he saw this image that was taken with a LiDAR that showed wave at very high altitude over Sweden. So that kind of piqued his interest, and he discovered that there's something called the polar night jet or the polar vortex that occurs in the stratosphere in the polar regions at the wintertime at the pole. And so he asked me, for feedback on the Soar Eagle, and there are things that we did in Soar Eagle, like the pressure suit has an exhaust on the chest, and basically that's what controls the pressure. And we put a cover over it and a tube to the back of the airplane so that the moisture in your breath didn't end up on the inside of the canopy. And that worked really well. So he copied that, for instance, when he did his Perlan 1 project with Steve Fawcett. Mm-hmm. He and Steve ended up setting the world altitude record in El Calafate. Yeah. And on the way down, they decided they wanted to build a pressurized version.
Yes.
Two reasons. Number one, no matter how well you seal the canopy, when it's minus 70 out or so, it's going to shrink enough that essentially the inside of the cockpit's going to be the same temperature as the outside. So they were extremely cold, and the pressure suit starts pressurizing at 35,000 feet. So by the time you get to 50,000 feet, it's really stiff, so it's hard to move.
Right. Mm-hmm. So they decided to build a pressurized glider, and you became involved, I think, about 2010?
2011, yes.
2011 with the Perlan 2 project.
Yes.
Yeah. And since then, you've now the world altitude record holder several times. The last one being you flew with Tim Gardner.
Correct.
Up to
6,124 feet pressure altitude.
76,124 feet pressure altitude. I guess the main question for me is, as a glider pilot that I'd like to ask, a lot of us have been flying in wave up to 20, 25,000 feet,
right,
which is amazing. But what's it like, the actual experience of being up at 4,000 feet? Is it very different, or is it just like being in a normal wave flight?
Probably the biggest difference is the true airspeed difference. If you get to 90,000 feet, which is a design level for the Perlan 2, your true airspeed is 6.7 times your indicated airspeed. Now, the wind speed is also very high. I think we had 160 knots or so on the day we got to 76,000 feet. So it is fortunate that the true airspeed increases, otherwise you wouldn't be able to stay up there. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. We're actually kind of busy in the Perlan because the outside visibility is not very good with the size of the windows. So you spend a lot of attention making sure that you don't get lost or lose control. And the images out the window, just looking out the window, what we see is what you see in the tail camera images. Yeah. It's just surreal to realize that the Earth is so far down, things are so small. Mm-hmm. It is, of course, cold up there. Now, we're pretty comfortable because we're using electric insoles. Yeah. But it's a fantastic experience to have invested so much time and energy in the project to have the culmination of the flight at high altitude. That was a pretty fantastic experience.
Yes, indeed. And you also had set other records in that flight, didn't you? Because you were towed up to quite a high altitude before you released.
Yeah, what we discovered is the stratospheric wave and the tropospheric wave are not always aligned. So making the transition from the tropospheric wave to the stratospheric wave can sometimes be a challenge. We did it on the first record when we got to 54,000 feet. But the Grove, which was an airplane that Einar Enevoldsen had tested, gave us the opportunity to tow to the stratosphere directly, which saves quite a bit of time. And of course, we're constrained by our oxygen supply. The pressurization is done by an air bottle. The cabin is like a space capsule. It's designed to have very low leak rates. And as the air leaks out, we just add air from the scuba bottle to keep the pressure where we want it. So the Grove, it's a G520, was designed to go to, I think the service ceiling's about 51,000 feet for it. And we've made, 14 or 15 tows above 40,000 feet with it, including one to 47,100 feet, which, if it was a record, would be, I think, the record for the highest tow ever.
Right. So the goal of the Perlan project is to get to 90,000, yeah?
That's the design.
A design. So in order to do that, you have to completely re-engineer, as you say, come up with pressurized cockpit, etc.
Right.
Yeah. And so where are you up to in the Perlan project now?
Well, based on our success at 76,000 feet and the review of all the engineering data, we've cleared ourselves at 90,000 feet, so we now just need to be someplace where the wave goes to 90,000 feet to get there. Yeah. Last year we went to Argentina for the first time in a while because of COVID and other things. And unfortunately, the weather compared to other years, was not very good. So we got to 60,300, which for most people would be a huge success, but for us it was a little bit of disappointment. But we're trying to do some science along the way. We've got several instruments we carry on the airplane, and of course the biggest science is just proving these waves go there. We carry CubeSats, so over the years we've carried numerous little CubeSats, which are experiments that schools have made. Schools from elementary schools up through university have given us experiments. And we've been trying to inspire people. We've had several interns that have worked with us, and every one of them is doing great. They're working on hydrogen airplanes now. One of them is managing a hydrogen airplane test and doing other things.
Great. And you're going back to Argentina this winter? Their winter?
Not this year. No, we need to raise a little bit more money to go back. And the hydrogen project has been consuming a lot of our time recently, so we've been focusing on the hydrogen project.
Okay, well, that's very good. And you've got a couple of aircraft in this hangar, which look absolutely fascinating, and you'll show us around?
Absolutely, yes.
All right. So thanks very much for talking to me, Jim Payne, and we'll now have a look at some of these amazing aircraft.